Yeah, it's funny. When I was in school, it was straight A's, hit math, fell off a cliff. They didn't even know that dyscalculia was a thing back then, like dyslexia, remember? And they said, well, if you're doing so well in English, you should be able to do well in math. And now, as a writer, I know that being good at English and being good at math do not necessarily ride in the same car. Yeah. That's the realm of the hard science fiction crowd, and they can have it, Well, you met. It's funny. My wife and I, neither of us can do math properly. Our son is a whiz at it, and I mean, we're doing simple arithmetic, and we're struggling. It's that bad, It's It's a humbling thing when you can be good at one thing and try something else, and you feel like you've just lost like 90 IQ points just trying to figure the tax on a restaurant bill. Yeah. If I was working that store, I think I would just turn around and walk out the building, move to another town. So you guys having fun here at 20 Books? Yeah, this is my first time live here. I kind of teleported in last year. It's a lot. First of all, it's a lot bigger than I thought it was. One of the things I like about it, I'm a traditionally published writer, but one of the things I love about this sort of an approach is it puts a shine on independent, because obviously the desire to improve craft, to understand business, to be a viable competitor in the book selling space. This is everything that is the opposite of what the standard view of independent publishing is. The way you guys approach it. First off, I've read some of your books, and I've cover quoted a bunch of them and just talked to a lot of people who are writing in development. There is no difference between traditional and independent writing. The publishing, arms, of course they have different ways of doing it. It's different arms of business. But the writing is the writing is the writing. And a lot of the old mythology and prejudice against independent publishing I'm seeing crumble, day by day by day. And that's a pretty encouraging thing. And it's also fun to see people who are experimenting as hybrid writers. My buddy Scott Sigler, who's a New York Times bestseller for his science fiction and horror and stuff, but he self-publishes, for those sports fans out here, the Galactic Football League, and those things are massively popular. In fact, sometimes he's making more off that than he is off his traditional stuff. And he was the first hybrid writer I met. And he just approaches a book as a book as a book, and we just need to find the best way to get it out, whether it's through a traditional arm or doing it ourselves. And that level of integrity and respect for the reader, because that's a big component of it, and I'm seeing it with so many people here, that respect for the reader elevates it. And so in some ways, sometimes more than traditional, because it's a more personal relationship between writer and reader when you're indie, and the respect for the reader is necessarily more obvious, and more obvious when it's not there. So I have become, over the last 10 years, a huge fan of indie writing. Also, you guys in indie get to take a lot more creative risks than is sometimes allowed in traditional publishing, and I envy you bastards for that. Just saying. Okay, it is 8:15, and I'm going to get started. For those who don't know me, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. My name is Jonathan Maberry. I am a multi-genre author. I write horror, science fiction, fantasy, thrillers, mysteries. Actually, in fantasy, I do epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and a few other versions of that. I edit anthologies. I'm actually editing my 22nd and 23rd anthology right now. I edit Weird Tales magazine, which we're having our 100th anniversary next year. And I just got an email this morning that Laurel Hamilton and R.L. Stine are both going to write stories for the 100th anniversary issue. Yeah, that's going to be Laurel Hamilton and R.L. Stine in the same magazine. Now, that I don't think has ever happened before. If you ever read her stuff or his stuff, Goosebumps and Anita Blake, it's a really interesting combination. So that's going to be fun. And also, I work in, to some degree in the Hollywood space. I had a TV series for one season based on some books I did that was a different spin on vampires. I went science fiction rather than supernatural on vampires and that. and it launched, it's a plague that created vampires. It launched at the beginning of COVID. Great time to launch a plague show, We had 27 million people watch the show with Ian Somerhalder from Vampire Diaries starring in it, and it died. I mean, Netflix killed it after the first season. Well, people have enough of plagues out there. So we'll be shopping at HBO. But so I do a lot of everything. Since I broke into fiction, I've written 46 and 9/10 novels. I'll finish the 47th next week. And in all different genres. Like the one I just finished was deep space science fiction. The one I'm writing now is the 13th of my Joe Ledger Weird Science Thriller series. The one after that is going to be kind of a Lovecraftian sort of thing. Then it's a fantasy novel. And that's kind of the fun of my career. I jump all over the place. The way I get into writing fiction, though, I had been a nonfiction guy my whole life. Magazine feature articles, greeting cards, all sorts of crap, And I had a 4-book deal with a small press in Pennsylvania. And the first 3 books in that deal were all martial arts books. I've been doing martial arts since I was 6. And so martial arts books, but we hadn't decided what the 4th book was going to be. Now, my grandmother, who was a wonderful lady who died at age 101, born on Halloween, which makes her even cooler. And if you know the character of Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter, imagine her as an old lady. My grandmother believed in everything. She believed in witches and werewolves and vampires and hinky punks and all sorts of things. And she was the relative. My parents were awful. She was the relative who kind of nurtured me whenever I came over to her house. And she would, from an early age, teach me about old school monsters, the folkloric versions of monsters. I had that exposure before I was old enough to watch like Double Chiller Theater in Philadelphia and actually see Universal and the Hammer vampires and so on. So I went into the whole pop culture monster thing with a different view. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to poll the audience a little bit. How do you kill a vampire? Raise your hands. All right, stake to the heart. Okay. Sunlight. Set it on fire. Silver bullet. Okay. One of you is right. The other 3 are wrong. And that's the thing. I'll take these one by one. Stake through the heart. There's only one vampire species, and I'm actually saying species, I'll explain what I mean in a second, around the world that is killed with a stake through the heart. The Kresnak of Dalmatia. No other vampire species is killed with a stake through the heart. How was Dracula killed in the book? You're going to say stake through the heart, right? No. He was stabbed with a Bowie knife and a kukri knife. He was stabbed to death and turned to dust. But because every single movie version of Dracula has him killed, or has other vampires within that story killed with a stake, it's become common thought, common belief, that that's how vampires were killed. In those countries that had strong vampire beliefs, and that's many of them, and also had burial rites where the body was buried in a coffin as opposed to cremated. In those days, a stake, which was usually basically a long piece of wood or even a spear, was driven through its stomach in the coffin to hold it down. The head would then be cut off, the mouth stuffed with garlic, head sometimes turned backwards, and the thing would be reburied. It's called the ritual of exorcism. And that's kind of faded from our public view in terms of what we think vampires are. And in fact, in the movies, you see them using garlic flowers to ward off vampires and so on, or just bulbs of garlic. They almost get that right, but they underplay it. In almost every country that has vampires that also has garlic as a crop, garlic is used to kill vampires. It is a blood purifier. So they would put the garlic in the mouth or bury the body with garlic because the idea was, or the thought was at the time, that the blood had become polluted by some evil thing. It's like demonic toxin is the way one writer referred to it. And the garlic would remove that pollution, and the vampire would die. Just a dead body again. Sunlight. Now, sunlight's a really popular one. It's a really convenient way to kill vampires in books and movies. In no place on earth has sunlight ever killed vampires. Dracula walked around in sunlight. You guys really need to reread the book. It's enlightening to reread the book especially as a writer, because now you're going through and seeing things that you thought you knew, but you knew only because they were filtered through movies and so on. And this, to me, opens up creative thought quite a bit. The Dracula was a little weaker during the day, but he could walk around during the day. The way sunlight came into it, I think it was 1922, they were making the silent film Nosferatu, which was, by the way, a complete ripoff of Dracula, and they were sued for it, and nearly every copy of the movie was ordered destroyed, but luckily one survived, so that's why we have the movie now. It was way over budget, over schedule. Most of the crew had walked off, a lot of the cast had walked off, and they could not afford to film the big dramatic finale that was their approximation of the big fight at the end of Dracula, where they go back to his castle and the gypsies are there and all that big fight. They couldn't afford to do that. So the lighting guy, who was one of the few tech people who hadn't left, said, look, to the director, F.W. Murnau, look, we've been shooting the vampire in darkness the whole time, moody and scary. Why don't we make it that he can't abide the light, and we'll have the woman kind of lure him into her bedroom and keep him there until dawn and the sunlight kill him. And the director's like, sure, fine, whatever, let's shoot that. And that's how it got into pop culture. Vampires, by the way, turning to dust because they've been staked. Hammer films did that pretty well. And in shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it was decided that they would just explode in the dust because then the show would have the burden of having Buffy and her friends remove the bodies. So these were conveniences, created by the writers. Set one on fire, burning it, that's usually a pretty good way of getting rid of darn near anything, I found. Not from personal experience, as far as you know. Silver bullets were not, except in the Blade movies, silver bullets were not used against vampires. They were used in fiction against werewolves. So let's, we'll get to werewolves in just a second. I love werewolves, my big furry friends. But also things about vampires. In a lot of world cultures, vampires are weirdly OCD. If you spread like rice on the ground or seeds on the ground, they are compelled then to stop and count them. I don't know how this started, and it shows up in cultures so disparate, like Peru and Poland, two countries that you assume did not have much contact a few hundred years ago, and yet it shows up, and I'm not sure why. I think the storyteller part of the people who are claiming they're vampires, it's like, well, now I've made this thing really big and bad and scary, and I need a reason for it not to have killed everyone. So you give it a flaw. Now, Bram Stoker did this with Dracula. Not the counting of seeds thing, because that would have looked silly. But what he did is he said he limited the powers. In the first part of the book, when Harker goes to Transylvania and meets Dracula, Dracula is badass powerful. I mean, there's even a point where he's laying in a coffin and Harker hits him in the face with a shovel, only opens a little flap of skin, that's it. Hard to kill, very dangerous creature. And Bram Stoker realized that. He's like, oh, crap, he gets to England, he's going to kill everyone. It's going to be a novella. So he decided to add a new bit of folklore where a vampire cannot enter a house unless invited. That's what actually kept the body count down, allowed the book to, the characters to survive long enough for it to be a longer book. And all of Bram Stoker's research notes are in display cases in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. And I used to love giving talks there every year about this because most people just don't know the folklore of the monsters. And the reason I focus on this is readers have become incredibly jaded about the monsters. As soon as they know it's a vampire, they're going to assume the vampire is going to get staked or trip over its cape and fall onto a piece of sharpened wood that just happens to be laying at the right angle. Or somebody's going to tear down curtains and is going to melt and all that. But all of that, I thought I turned that off. Hold on. Pardon me. I'll talk to my agent later. By us believing in the way in which monsters were killed only through folklore, we're missing a creative opportunity. Our readers already know how to kill vampires, they know how to kill werewolves. Some of them know how to kill both the George Romero-esque zombies and the Haitian zombies. They know how to do this, they know how to do that. because they've seen it so many times. They've seen the rules as created by storytellers in books and films. The problem is that removes tension if you're using that kind of monster again, because the characters will know the rules and the readers will know the rules, and they just simply are waiting for which twist on those rules the writer will have. Well, the real twist open to us that allows us to create something compelling and different is to not base the monster's powers and demise on what readers have seen before. Most readers have not read the folklore. The folklore is out there. So I kind of jumped ahead on one thing. I mentioned that when I had that fourth book in that contract, the fourth book I proposed was one that I thought my grandmother would like. All about how to, I called it the Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead. Big, like 700-page book. My publisher at the time thought I'd fried a neuron and asked me to do it under a pen name because he thought my martial arts readers would think I was nuts. So we put it out under the name Shane MacDougall. Shane being the Scottish for John. MacDougall's one of the Scottish clans my family's descended from. And it went about selling my martial arts books 30-1. But it also, for me, as I was researching it, I thought I knew a lot about it because my grandmother told me a lot about it. But, that was way before the internet days when you could do deep research on the net. So when I was writing my book, I was reaching out to folklore departments, usually the ones who are tracking this sort of stuff, all over the world. So if I wanted to know about monster types in Italy, I looked for the folklore department of universities in Italy and so on. And these people love to talk about it to writers because they're so frustrated that we have consistently gotten it wrong since probably the writing of Camilla, So we've been getting it wrong, and they want us to get it right. Now, mind you, we are talking about folkloric monsters that are probably not real. I say probably because my grandmother told me to keep an open mind. But they want us to be as accurate as possible. So I wrote that book, and during the research of it, and I'm talking to people all over the world, I'm finding monster types I've never heard of. The book actually it's not just vampires. It's vampires, werewolves, beast men, monster dogs, lake monsters, all sorts of things. And I've since done 5 other nonfiction books of that type. And they are what got me into writing fiction, because the more I researched, the more I wanted to read fiction that used the folkloric monsters, and there was very, very little of it. Now, I was writing this book in 2002, something like that. Very, very few books that used the folkloric monsters. And I kept complaining about it. My wife finally said, if we just stop complaining about it and write the damn thing, which weirdly had not occurred to me up to that point, because I never thought about writing fiction until that point. So I went up, I spent a couple of years teaching myself how to write a book, wrote my first novel, Ghost Road Blues. It came out in 2006. And one of the reasons that it was so popular is the readers could not figure out how the characters were going to defeat the monsters because they weren't normal versions of vampires and werewolves. There is a legend in a couple of different parts of Central Europe where if a werewolf is killed and is not buried properly, like on hallowed ground, it will return as a vampire. I read that, I was like, how is this not in 50 movies out now? How is this not 100 books? Because nobody's doing their folklore sounds boring until you read folklore. And then it's like, oh my God, it's so cool. So that became the backstory for my Ghost Road Blues. There was a werewolf in town 20 years ago. People thought it was a serial killer. Somebody killed it, kind of off screen, in a way, and then buried its body in a swamp. And its spirit came back as a vampire. Now, the thing about vampires, most people think that vampirism is spread through bites. In no fiction, in no folklore, is vampirism spread through bites. That is a conceit that began with Victorian, and actually even a little before that, mostly English fiction, where because there was an allegory to its being seduction or rape or other elements of taking through force, taking through coercion, taking through seduction against the will of the person. And that was pretty big in Victorian England, in terms of the themes you see in poetry. Read Goblin Market, read a bunch of other things, you'll see that reflected. But in actual folklore, and this is all over the world, to become a vampire, there's all sorts of ways of doing it. In India, for example, a woman who dies pregnant can become a vampire. Somebody, in a lot of cultures, if somebody is killed in the act of committing violence, they can become a vampire. In Greece, if you're born on Saturday, you can become a vampire. And there are also, by the way, people born on Saturday who hunt vampires, known as the Sabbatarians, who hunted those vampires. In certain cultures, if you're born a twin, one will be evil, one will be good. One will be a vampire, one will be human. And all these variations of vampires. And each one has its own powers, its own histories, its own vulnerabilities. There are some that are so bizarre that you have to kind of stretch what a vampire is. So, for example, in Vietnam, the vampire, its head and entrails rip out of the body and float around and devour energy for people. There's a vampire that's tied to Arabian myths that it will feed on faith. There are vampires that feed on emotions. There are vampires that are flesh eaters. So to understand the vampire, you have to kind of separate yourself from what the conventional thinking is. They're not all, pale Middle European guys, Eastern European guys in opera cloaks. That's for the stage. The real vampires, in most cultures, vampires are alive. People, actually people alive, who can go to church, have families, but they are vampires. Or they are recent dead who either physically or through their presence are able to feed on the life force of humans. And so let's categorize real quick the different types of vampires. There are the hemotophagous vampires. They're the ones who suck blood, drink blood. They account for a little less than 1/3 of the world's vampires. Less than 1/3. Then there's the necrophagous vampires, the ones who eat flesh. And there are a lot of those, and often they cross over. And even though the zombies that we think about, Walking Dead and so on, are based entirely on fiction, there are folkloric versions of monsters that, are like the Nachzehrer in Germany. It was this vampire slash undead cannibal creature that would just eat the flesh of the living, or sometimes eat the flesh of the dead. There are all kinds of vampires. In Haiti, the vampire tears its body open, and a ball of light goes around and attacks people, and so on. By looking deeper, by picking a country and just looking up vampire folklore or folkloric monsters, and you start finding that each country has a rich history of folkloric monsters, and almost every single one of them will be something the average person hasn't seen. And that means that you have a completely new model for a monster where the powers will be unknown. We had a question before we started about how much of the monster's backstory do you have to tell? Well, if it's just the same retread of vampire, you can pretty much just say vampire, and they'll take all the other stuff as read. But there's no fun in that. There's no discovery in that. There's no process of like a Van Helsing type coming to inform, or a group of people going out to find clues or to learn through attrition. That's what I did in my Ghost Red Blues book, because the people think everything they knew about how to fight vampires came from books and movies, and these aren't those vampires. Oops. In fact, the main vampire in that book doesn't need to bite anyone. It just takes corrupted souls, or souls that for one reason or another are more heavily on the sinner side than not, and it just darkens that so that they become a monster. And that's in keeping with about 15 or 20 different cultures where a vampire presence can infect the corrupt and make them monsters, which I think is really cool. Let's go werewolves for a second. Now, how do you kill a werewolf? I mentioned silver bullets. Okay, just tell me some other powers a werewolf has. Like, how does somebody become a werewolf? All right, it's bitten, and it's a curse, and it's passed on, and whoever they bite becomes a werewolf, and so on. We've all seen American Werewolf in London. We know the mythology, right? Except none of that's in folklore. Werewolves are active how many days of the month? Yeah, 3 days of the full moon. No, that's fiction. Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to get to those in a second. The, most of the werewolf lore is, again, wrong. Werewolves can become a wolf anytime they want. And they become a wolf, not a wolf man. In most cultures, when somebody turns into a werewolf, or in cultures where there are other transformative things, other theriomorphy, where you transform from human into something, like all through South America, most of the monster types, the were creatures, are jaguars, right? But they can turn into that anytime they want. Now, in Germany and other countries, there were ways. Sometimes they would have to wear a special belt, a magic belt, to turn into a werewolf, or a medallion or something. Or sometimes it was just they turned into a werewolf, or turned into a wolf. But the thing is, those wolves are wolves. They're absolutely as vulnerable as any other wolf. The whole thing about silver was constructed for the movies because they needed a way to stop the wolf, because they wanted a wolf man, which is more apparently powerful and dangerous than an ordinary wolf. So they need a correspondingly unusual way to stop it. And a silver-headed cane, which they used in the original Wolfman, was a convenient way. Plus, it gives you that thing, that weapon, it's like the magic sword. It gives you that. Whoever has that now has a chance. Whoever actually believes in it. Just like in some of the vampire movies, if somebody holds up a cross and they don't believe it, the cross doesn't work. But if they do believe it, it does work. And it's weird that every single vampire they fight is Christian. You know, what if it's Hindu? That would be a twist. Or you know, Jewish. They've done some comedy versions of that. But werewolves are just wolves. Now, werewolves are not necessarily evil, but here's the thing about this. In France and Germany, and to a lesser degree Italy, for centuries there were people being put on trial as werewolves. And those trials are well documented, and you can find transcripts online. If you read the transcript of the werewolf, what you have is someone who acted in a bestial manner, sometimes cannibalistic, was sly and clever, would hide its prey, would be otherwise normal and part of society. What does that sound like to you? Yeah, serial killers. They had no concept of serial killer back then, but somebody who acted like a monster. You know, they couldn't imagine an ordinary human being just turning cannibal and, you know, chomping on villagers in rural France. So they had to give it, they had to make it monstrous, supernatural. And of course they put them on trial and they killed them. And it was also one of those things you could blame other people for. If there were suspicious deaths in the area, you could just blame the person you don't like, you know, because those whole trial things. But werewolves, you know, were creatures were, you know, pretty common, and they were serial killers. Now, folklorically, if you want to stick with the monster, and by the way, that makes a nice twist. If somebody is hunting what they think is a werewolf, and it turns out they're hunting a serial killer who is embodying that level of bestiality and may even believe that they're a werewolf. You could even go point of view, you know, and I love these breakaway point of views, where that person as the monster is hunting, but they may actually be physical form. They may be the unreliable narrator of their own story. They're still human, but they're acting as a monster. Or you could simply switch the model and and go into the head of the monster itself. And they've done that in a variety of stories. They even did it to a degree in the Jaws novels. If you ever read the Jaws novels, sometimes, especially the second one, it shifts to the point of view of the shark. It's in that monster. I actually did a story, a zombie story, where in the very opening of the book called Dead at Night, it's the very first victim of the first zombie bite who's waking up. It's a coroner, you know, got bitten by the infected person on the table, but the patient zero of the story. And I keep cutting back and forth to his experience. Now, what I did, I took the standard zombie model because it was a George Romero-esque type of zombie, but I wanted to give it a spin. In that particular case, the consciousness of the person who has become a zombie remains. They're still connected to all five senses. All sensory input is still there, but they're not connected anymore to the motor function. So they are helpless passengers inside their own body, feeling, tasting, smelling, hearing, everything, as their body is driven to go out and kill. And who would monsters like that kill? The people around them, friends, family, and so on. So he's actually a helpless captive in his own body as his body kills his family. And we return to that. And he keeps wanting someone to kill him throughout the book, but he can't articulate that. Now, I wrote that, and this is one of the pathways into selecting the way in which you're going to interpret a monster. You know, we often take autobiographical elements. So at the time I was writing this, my father-in-law, who was a noted jazz musician, recorded with Sinatra and Billie Holiday, really great guy, was going through dementia. And every day we saw more of him go away and less of his clarity, but we saw sometimes, especially when he was really in the later stages of dementia, sometimes he would have a moment of true clarity, and you can see in his eyes the horrible awareness of what he is going through and what that is doing to his family. Because dementia isn't quick. I mean, he had it for 17 years, 18 years. And he was a very healthy guy that died at 98. But, you know, the healthiness of his body kept him going longer. So the disease form lasted longer, the impact on the family lasted longer, the horror was deeper, and I took that and put it into fiction. It's started quite a few conversations with people who know people who have gone through Alzheimer's or dementia or some other thing that has taken away the version of the person they want. I had long talks with George Romero, who wrote and directed Night of the Living Dead. We were friends in the last 5 years of his life, and he said that a lot of his zombie stuff, you know, came from partly was political, you know, during political shifts back in the 50s and 60s, the Cold War. You know, you find out that somebody you liked suddenly is, you know, they're a closet communist, you know, that sort of thing. That fear that was so present back then. When somebody that you know, for whatever reason, becomes the other, whatever that other is, that is a terrifying moment. Underplayed in this, in most zombie stories these days, what you see are somebody becomes a zombie, then there's grief, usually a grief scene as somebody's dying, and then when they become a zombie, they just either kill it, Walking Dead, real quick, like you can stab every single part of the skull with a knife. Here to tell you that's not possible. But also, they seem to lose their emotional connection to who that person is. Maybe a scene or two, but then it's over. If my wife turned into a zombie and I was forced to kill her, I would never recover from that. It would inform my entire life. Why then, in books and movies, does it not inform the path of the character growth? Why is that not an echo that isn't followed through the whole thing? Because talk about instant PTSD, that's a level of trauma nothing could possibly prepare us for. And for us to do that, to write that with a degree of insight and honesty, makes the story shine brighter than other stories where they're just regurgitating the same old stuff. Now, I know some of you were in my talk yesterday about post-apocalyptic fiction, and something I said that resonates also for this here too. If you're writing about the monster, and your focus is primarily the monster, with some exceptions, you're missing the opportunity of telling a story about people in crisis. People in crisis is the basis for fiction. We do not write, we are not writers to tell happy stories about a nice group of people having a great week. That does not make a good book. There's no tension, there's no crisis, there's nothing for them to achieve or strive for or accomplish and have their lives changed because of. We step into these characters' lives and we create a crisis moment and force the characters to deal with it, and that is the richness of the story. Well, horror often does this and doesn't get a lot of credit for it, but not all horror writers take the risks of diving into things in their own family, their own experiences, even things that have happened to themselves, and using that as the seed to be able to take a monster and elevate it, a monster story, and elevate it to the level of a real human drama. By tapping into folkloric monsters, because they are so underutilized and people don't know the rules, you as a writer of fiction can take that, the historical elements of that, and then, like Bram Stoker and everyone else, manipulate those rules to create your own version of that monster. You have something the reader will not have seen, but even if they have seen it, you're putting a twist on it. That's the fun of it. That allows you to write a story with deep character richness, plots that will not be easily understood, or easily followed rather, and solved. Also allows the reader to know more than they did when they began. I love stories that when I read it, I know more than I did when I picked up the book. And I'm not talking writing something that is a folkloric treatise on everything about that monster. When I write my novels, I tend to overwrite the first draft with all the fun research, because I'm a research junkie like most of you are, because we're writers. People hate playing Jeopardy and Trivial Pursuit with us because we have a lot of information. But we treasure that information because we've earned it by the research and the thought and all of that. And it can go in your first draft. And then you should carve about 98% of it out of your second draft, because you need to leave only what the reader needs to know and some juicy bits, some extra things. And I like the extra things. Now, when I was deciding to pick a werewolf as a protagonist, the werewolf was the hero. It's a whole series of stories I've written. It's actually collected into a book called Beneath the Skin. The character is a private investigator who happens to be a werewolf. And the species of werewolf he is called the Benindante. It means good walker. Now, the Benindante were, these families in Italy go back, some of them to Etruscan times, or claim to go back to Etruscan times. Their belief is, and has been for all these years, that at night they become werewolves and they hunt evil. So they are werewolves on the side of heaven fighting monsters. That is just too cool not to do something with. I've never seen it in a novel or a movie. There was one issue of, I don't know, it was eerie or creepy years ago that did it, but nobody else has done it. So I decided to do it. And when he becomes the werewolf, when he takes on a client, that client becomes part of his pack, and he will do anything to protect his pack. Because the Benindante became werewolves, but they became actual wolves with human intelligence, I wanted to go a little further. I wanted him to be the standard wolf man type, because I like the wolf man type. It's easier to construct a fight scene with a bipedal werewolf rather than basically a big dog running around. It's just more fun to write that. It's more dramatic opportunities. It carries with it a little more vulnerability for the character, but also makes the character two things at once, human and monster, more visibly in the story. And that was my take on it. And that's the thing. If we dive into folklore, we can find that thing that nobody else has, and then we should put our take on it. It shouldn't just be an article disguised as a short story or a novel. You want to be able to manipulate it. And there are all sorts of critters like that. For those who watch the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, its spinoff, Angel was supposed to be the anti-hero, the hero of the whole thing. He was the monstrous, vampire cursed with his soul again, which, he's still a vampire, but he was now a good guy. But when he loses his soul, he becomes a monster again. Not actually so much heroic. That's not a heroic thing. That's a curse. The fact that he does good is because he fell in love with somebody, and yay for teen romance, basically Romeo and Juliet with fangs. But there was a character named Spike in that series, and Spike is actually the heroic vampire, because he was an evil vampire who fell in love while still an evil vampire, and then chose to go out and fight to reclaim his soul, and reclaimed it, and actually went up saving the world in the process. He's actually the heroic vampire, and he is close to a type of vampire in folklore called Stregoni Benefici. Stregoni Benefici were vampires that were captured by priests in part of the Inquisition, the Italian version of it, not the Spanish version, captured by the church and tortured until they accepted Jesus again. And from then on, they would be essentially vampire assassins for the church. This is in church history records. I love that it's in those records. It makes me so happy to know that this is official church history. So having a hitman vampire, people have played with redeemed vampires, but I have yet to see a hitman vampire. Somebody who's, essentially a Stregone Benefici, who was either forced or chose to become a good guy again. We've had those as cops. Forever Night was another example of that. But we haven't seen it in the hitman idea. And it seems like an obvious one. But that's the problem, is the writers aren't reading enough folklore. Writers would look at that and go, hell, well, I can write that. that's why you read folklore, because it's an endless, bottomless well of ideas. It's fantastic. Now, we have only 9 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Because I have lots more I can say, but yes. Or yell it and I'll repeat it, either one. And if anybody else has any questions, now's the time to go on.
I was just wondering about the origin of the lich. Like, where did that come from?
Origin of the
lich.
The lich? Well, there are a number. You're talking about the horse leech character?
Lich, like undead, supreme, blah, yada, yada.
That's more religious history than it is folklore. It's not an area I'm as expert on, by the way, so I won't be able to answer that one with any authority. I had to pick the one I couldn't do. Damn you. But that does things. I've written 5 books on the subject, and I'm always finding new monsters. So I'm actually considering a 5th and maybe even a 6th book on monsters. Every time one of those books is reprinted or goes out there again, I start getting emails from people all over the world saying, hey, have you heard about this version of the monster? It's like in one of the, after the first book, I was working on the second, and somebody said, have you heard about a Draugr, which is the spirit of a ghost of a dead Viking that inhabits, or evil spirit that inhabits a dead Viking. It rises, and it can't be killed by any weapon. It can only be defeated by a hero in unarmed combat. Well, that's badass. I mean, there's an action story waiting to be written. Some people have used it a bit, but underutilized it. I know we're running short on time. One of the other things you can do is you can play with the idea of the monster as a bit of misdirection. So, for example, we talked about the blood drinking and the flesh eating vampires. There's also another slightly bigger category called the essential vampires, the ones that feed on some essence, breath, blood, sexual essence, and so on. There's a lot of different types of essential vampires. I did 2 books, Glimpse and Ink, that dealt with essential vampires. Glimpse, the vampire in there, and it's not called a vampire, feeds on the very last bit of hope left in you. It's distilled down to that last bit before despair takes over. So he drives his victims to the point where hope is that pure. The second book I did, Ink, it's about a vampire type, essential vampire type. If you have a tattoo that is tied to some really important emotion, like one of the characters has a tattoo of her murdered daughter on her hand, so she can see her daughter all the time, and the vampire just brushes it, and hour by hour, that tattoo fades from her, appears on him. He can relive and feed on those emotions, and she loses them forever, which means that as soon as the tattoo disappears, she has forgotten her daughter forever. Now that isn't fangs or claws, but it's creepy as hell. That particular vampire is a made-up one, but it's inspired by all these folkloric essential vampires that feed on different things. Like, if you wanted to do something, with a non-supernatural vampire, sudden infant death syndrome. You guys have heard of this, right? Put a healthy baby to bed, and in the morning it's dead. No marks, no nothing. Well, a few hundred years ago, people were not willing to accept that the kid just died. They didn't understand what sudden infant death syndrome was. Of course, it wasn't even a concept. So it had to be something. The fact that an innocent child will just randomly die shakes faith, right? And faith, especially centuries past, was important in every culture, in every village. So in order for there to be some degree of balance, the people had to believe that a monster did this. And since sudden infant death syndrome it rarely hits the same family twice, when this would happen, of course, they would go pray or go to the priest, village priest or shaman or whatever. They would be given talismans or acts of contrition to do or something. And of course, as I said, SIDS doesn't usually hit the same family again. So it enforces that those prayers, those talismans, those charms worked. So now you have an entrenched belief with proof, and the fact that there is something the church can give you to protect you against the monster actually balances and reinforces faith, which is, if somebody wants to write a faith-based story, that's a new twist. That's really great. Stories that challenge our accepted view of things, the serial killer werewolf, deaths that are a mystery story, because the SIDS death thing could be a mystery story. Modern vampire types, like in Malawi, Africa. In the early days of HIV, UN doctors were going to third world countries in Africa because AIDS was, burning through Africa really fast. And in Malawi, the villagers saw these pale people coming in and taking blood. So that equated vampire to them, and they killed them. Now, from the UN point of view, World Health Organization point of view, those people did something horrible. From the villager point of view, they saved the village from the monsters. That kind of story doesn't have to have a supernatural element, but it does tap in on folklore, because you can set it wherever you set it, you then tap into the folklore that would reinforce the belief that killing these people is appropriate. It becomes a tragedy story when viewed from every angle, but it's also wrapped around some character's heroic moment saving the village. See, that's the sort of thing that if you're just trying to retread vampires, you're never going to get to that kind of story, that kind of emotional depth. But if you're taking folklore and trying to get inside the heads of people in other cultures, and by the way, when I talk about folklore, I am not just talking about the folklore of Western and Eastern Europe, which is where most of our vampire and so on beliefs come from. Here's a funny thing. In Transylvania, there are no vampire legends in Transylvania. There are ghost legends, the strigoi, but they're not vampires. There are ghosts that feed on, there's technically essential vampires, but you don't have the fanged vampires. Almost every other Eastern European country has fanged vampires, the Upierchi and all the other forms of it, but Transylvania does not, which I think is kind of cool. But they're up to their eyeballs in ghosts and all kinds of pernicious, monstrous, murderous ghosts. That would be something too. If somebody's a vampire hunter and maybe the person they're after, and this is off the top of my head, if I was going to write this, the person they're after is just a killer, but while they're there are other things going on. It turns out to be some other, like a ghost rather than a vampire. It creates a new dynamic, because if you come there armed to fight vampires and you're fighting a murderous ghost, you're kind of up shit's creek. It's like, oh well, now what? It's like bringing a hammer and a stake to fight Godzilla. Wrong tools for the job, and that is character crisis. That's the sort of thing that then becomes a pivot point in the story to deepen the threat level of the characters and therefore amp up the readability and excitement of the actual story. And that's kind of the takeaway for this. Go read folklore. I'm not saying necessarily go out and buy mine, but there's dozens and dozens of books out there. Gordon Melton has the Vampire Encyclopedia. Brad Steiger did a book on werewolves. Lots of books on ghosts. But do yourself a favor. Well, two things. One, if you know where your family comes from, like my family is Scotland, Scandinavia, and weirdly, Pashtun, a blue-eyed tribe in Afghanistan. Crusades, somebody got lost, who knows. So if I was going to do folkloric stories based on my own family line, Scotland has a gazillion monsters, little red caps and all sorts of things. Scandinavian monsters like the Draugr and so many others. I would go looking for something in Afghanistan, because that one little % of my family background is there, and it gives me some degree of agency and interest to want to go find a monster to tell a story in. If you whatever culture you are from, and whether it's a national culture or a religious culture, or philosophical culture, whatever, there are monsters attached to every belief system. If you want to explore those, that gives you firm ground to stand on to start, because it's familiar. But I would advocate taking risks and going to a little deeper. And I know just about out of time here. One of the things I like doing is, if I know someone is not only from another culture, but is familiar with it, not just like 5 generations removed, but maybe their family moved from Pakistan, or they moved from some other place that I'm not as familiar with, I'm going to grill that person and find out as much as I can about their folkloric beliefs, because I want to dive into it. And as an editor, I do this a lot myself, wanting people to tap into their cultures, because it'll be their version of what makes them afraid, which is going to be different than my version. I already know what my version is. I want to see what your version is, and that's where horror is going to take its next big jump. Okay, we're out of time, folks. If you have any questions, I'll be around. Just hit me anywhere else out here. Or if you want my card, grab my card and send me an email.